All right, good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for all of you for coming out on a cold, not quite wintry, but wet night at least, with the change in weather that we had. My name's Kevin Pollock. I'm a historic site manager with the Prince William County Office of Historic Preservation. Of course, you're here at our second lecture of the winter lecture series that we have. We'll get more to the speaker here in just a moment, but this is part of a series of lectures that we do here in the Old Manassas Courthouse. So just a few housekeeping items, if I may, before we get started. There are restrooms located downstairs, and there is also one, I'll go ahead and open up the door, one directly behind me, behind the speaker, in case you need to use one upstairs as well. And we do have elevator access in case anybody needs help getting down the stairs at the end of the program. Just come find me and let me know, and I'll be happy to help you out with that. So just a couple of the other lectures that we do have coming up here. Again, they are all on the fourth Thursday of the month, starting here at 7 p.m. Next month, we're going to have Dr. Jim Pykutch speaking about a Prince William County native in the American Revolution. That's Light Horse Harry Lee in the War for Independence. On April 28th, we'll have historian Don Hackinson speaking about John Mosby's combat operations in Prince William County. And then one quick change I will make to the schedule is May 26th program. We'll have historian and author John Eric Gillot speaking about the Newby family of Prince William County. That program is no longer going to be here. Instead, we're moving it to Brentsville Courthouse Historic Center, which is a site actually related to the Newby family. And those of you who might know the story of Dangerfield Newby has a direct correlation to Brentsville, so we decided to move that program over there. A couple of other programs of note that I'll just point out. Coming up this Wednesday, March 2nd, for those of you who are interested in history and perhaps a little bit more of an informal setting, we'll be having our first Take a Sip of History program at Tin Cannon Brewing in Gainesville from 6 to 8 p.m. That program is free, and the topic is going to be Tales of Prince William's Citizens at War, ranging all the way from the French and Indian War to more modern conflicts. And then the last program that I'll go ahead and mention is our 7th annual Prince William and Manassas History Symposium, which will be held right here in this room on Saturday, March 26th. It will be a day-long history symposium with various speakers talking about various topics related to Prince William County and Manassas history. But we'll go ahead and get into tonight's program. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Michael Brantley, who will be our speaker this evening. He is an award-winning writer, photographer, journalist, and professor from Nash County, North Carolina. His book, which will be the topic of tonight's talk, Galvanized, the Odyssey of a Reluctant Carolina Confederate, was nominated for the Sam Reagan Nonfiction Award and the Wiley Silver Prize for the Best Civil War Book of 2020. His first book, Memory Cards, Portraits from a Rural Journey, reached #1 on Amazon in nonfiction and in memoir in 2016. Michael has worked in newspapers and for magazines since he was a teenager and has been writing a humor column for the Nashville Graphic for nearly 25 years. You get both history and humor here with Michael. The best of those columns are available in a new book, A Time in the Land, and I will say he does have some of his books for sale here this evening. Before going into teaching, he operated a photography studio in Nashville for 18 years, and he also has a blog called historypie.com. He currently teaches journalism, creative writing, English, and photography at Barton College, where he also graduated from with a degree in communications. He holds a master's degree in English from East Carolina University and an MFA in creative writing from Queen's University of Charlotte. Michael lives in southern Nash County, where he traveled to us today, with his wife, Christy, who's a historian with the state of North Carolina, and his 3 children. So please join me in welcoming all the way from North Carolina, Michael Brantley, for tonight's program.
Thanks. Thank you. Let's see how long it takes me to knock this thing off here. Thank you all for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here. The last time a member of my family was here, they were being shot at. And after talking to Kevin for a little bit, it might have been some of his folks that did the shooting. I don't know. But then, then tonight I come back and I get taken out to dinner and get to talk to you folks. So I'm pretty excited to be here, though, and thank you all for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and maybe read a little bit about it. I've been interested in the Civil War. This was one of the things we were talking about. I've been interested in the Civil War and studying it since I was a little kid. We didn't have very many books. I grew up in eastern North Carolina. We didn't have many books when I was growing up, but we did have the World Book encyclopedias. And, they do a real good job of telling you just a little bit about everything, at least if it happened before 1968. I believe that was when ours were printed. And I used to joke that I was still, when I was about 12, in the early 80s, I used to joke that I was still waiting to figure out what happened in Vietnam, because that's where the book stopped. But one book that really, I think, hooked me on the Civil War was this, I don't know if y'all remember those cloth-bound books that had the old tape on the spine, and it was called The Civil War, and I don't remember who wrote it, but on the front there was a Confederate soldier and a Union soldier, and they were crossing bayonets. And it's pretty dramatic, and it got my attention. And it's beautifully illustrated. It wasn't the Harper's Weekly illustrations, but it was that style. And so all the major battles were just beautifully illustrated, and you could see expressions on faces, and there was a map, and it sort of laid out in the front and the back, who was on what side. And I remember that book, and I was telling Kevin that years later, I wanted to point out to him I didn't steal it, but I do have that copy because it ended up being discarded by the elementary school library, and they dumped all that stuff where I went to high school. And I got that book, and I was so excited to see it, and I flipped to the back, and on the little checkout card, I think I was the only person that ever checked it out, at least after about 1950. My name was on there about 6 or 7 times. But anyway, so I was interested in that, and so my book is called The Odyssey of a Reluctant Carolina Confederate, and it's the story of my great-great-grandfather. Make sure I got all the great-great-great-grandfather. When I started, I did not know he was my great-great-grandfather. So I'll get into that a little bit in a minute. But just to tell you about this guy just a little bit, and I'll show you, I'll have a picture of him for you here in just a second. That's actually, maybe I'll go ahead and pull that. There we go. His name's Wright Stephen Batchelor. And so he was an interesting guy, and all of this stuff that's all the way through here, and especially here, it looks nice and neat in a little concise space, and every one of those things took forever to dig out. It was hard to find something on somebody that wasn't famous. But he served in the Confederate Army. He was in the 47th North Carolina, Company A, and they were known as the Chikura Guards. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out why they called themselves that. If you know anything about Chikura, that's the Indian tribe from South Carolina. And the county I'm from and that he was from is nowhere near South Carolina. I never could find a connection. I went through many written records and letters and never did find out why they came up with that name. So that's an unsolved mystery. But he was in that unit. He also served in the Union Army. He was in the 1st U.S. Volunteers. He returned to the Confederate Army, and then he walked home from Appomattox. And then when he came home, he ran the county the county poorhouse. And we'll talk about his brief political career. And he became a radical Republican, which is not something you hear about many rural Confederates after the war. And then if that wasn't enough, he was involved in a bizarre murder in front of the Nash County Courthouse in broad daylight. So we'll talk about that a little bit too. But anyway, despite him being such an interesting character, I never once heard his name mentioned or anything about him when I was growing up. Nothing. I never heard anything about him. The way I found out about him was we were in a neat store. My wife and I had gone. There's a Civil War bookstore that's close to us called Broadfoot's. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it. If you go to Appomattox and look up something about your ancestors, it'll see a little thing at the bottom. It'll say verified by Broadfoot. And they have a place in Wilmington and then a place in Wendell, which isn't far from where we live. And it's just a little place that if I sent you out there on directions, you would think I was sending you to some deserted place to be killed because it is out in the middle of nowhere. But it's the neatest store, and it's all Civil War books, things that are out of print and hard to find. But we were in there looking some genealogy things because they had the troop books. And so I was looking people with my last name, Brantley, and they were all kind of in the same unit, and I saw this entry for Wright Stephen Batchelor. And it got my attention because if you look up privates in those books, you'll usually see 2 lines, date of service and date of discharge, and then if they were killed or wounded, and that's about it. But this guy, he had a paragraph, and part of the paragraph was captured at Gettysburg and escaped. And I thought that was pretty interesting, so I wrote it down, and I thought I was going to include it in my first book that Kevin mentioned, Memory Cards. I was planning on doing something about the importance of family when I was growing up and the importance of family in the South and sort of the tradition of that. And so, but every time I would find a little something, it just made more questions. So I kind of chased this guy for a little while. And then maybe I'll talk about in a little bit how I found out I was related to him. But like I said, I never heard him mentioned. As a matter of fact, I'll just go ahead and tell you, a guy came in from the local Sons of Confederate Veterans, and they were having a fundraiser. and he wanted some things framed at our photography studio. And when we were talking about payment, I knew his wife had a common last name with my family. And I said, I heard your wife had some information on Wright Stephen Batchelor. He says she sure does. And I said, well, if you'll give me that, we'll just call it even, because it was just a little simple repair job. And he said, yeah, I'll do that. And when he left, he turned around and got to the door. He said, by the way, you know you're related to that guy, right? And I had no idea until that minute that I was related to him. And then a little more digging, I found out not only was I related, he's my great-great-grandfather. So we'll talk about some theories about why I never heard of him, I think, in a little bit. But if it's okay with y'all, I was going to read you a little bit from the first chapter of the book, sort of give you an idea of kind of, I guess, where I'm going with this. And it's the first chapter. It's just a couple of pages, and that chapter is called Homecoming. The man straggling down the dusty eastern North Carolina dirt road was dark and dirty and wore tattered clothes. A threadbare shirt, worn gray trousers, and shoes coming apart at the seams. It was an exceptionally warm day for early spring, and he was hot. Black matted hair jutted from his head in all directions under a kepi cap, bleeding into a ratty beard that hung nearly to his chest. He was bean-pole thin, his shoulders drooped. His eyes were sunken with heavy dark circles underneath. He looked wild, feral, and hollow. Sally Ann, a plain but pretty woman in her 30s, was preparing to call her children from the fields for a midday meal and had to stop and take a long look. Was this an outlaw, somebody who might do them harm? In the last months of the war, since it ended, reports of roving bands of marauders was not uncommon. The location of her husband's shotgun slipped through her thoughts quickly. In the chaos and desperation of the current state of affairs, she had to be constantly vigilant for robbers, scoundrels, and desperados. Word was that Robert E. Lee had surrendered in Virginia, but the war continued, and that devil Bill Sherman was in North Carolina, camped at the state capital, Raleigh. She'd heard nothing of her beloved and wasn't even sure if he was still alive. She'd heard little more than rumors of his whereabouts. Suddenly, she recognized the gait as one she hadn't seen in 3 years. The stranger was her husband, alive and in one piece. A blessing. Sally Ann pulled at her skirt hem and broke into a trot toward him, calling out through tears of jubilation and disbelief. But the physical reunion would have to wait. The man raised his arm. "Stop right there," he yelled. "Don't come no closer. I meet up with all kinds of mess." Exhausted, weary, hungry, and defeated, he instructed his wife to fill up a tub of water in the yard and keep the young'uns away lest he infest them with lice and filth that had consumed him. Sally Ann nodded and turned back to the house, calling to her oldest 4 children who had all gathered on the porch to help her. They were startled by the commotion over the man that they were just now beginning to recognize, something they could hardly believe. The children could barely contain themselves as they hauled buckets of water and dumped it into the old wash tub. "Daddy, Daddy," they shouted over and over. The man, 5'7" with brown-black eyes and sun-worn leathery features, was excited to see his family, but he was done in and looked older than his years. The two youngest children, barely knee-high, stared at the spectacle, wondering who the stranger was and how anyone so filthy could strip off all his clothes in the yard and not be yelled at or run off by their mama. Wright Stephen Batchelor was finally home from the Civil War. He had walked 135 miles from Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia since April 9th, 1865, all the way to the outskirts of Nashville, a rural county seat town in Nash County, North Carolina. Once he had drowned all the lice, his wife burned his clothes and brought him some of his old things to wear, which hung on him like a scarecrow. He had seen some things that many men chose not to talk about. He'd survived horrors unimaginable, death, disease, and destruction, and all the in-between, the worst of human suffering. Misery had been his constant companion over the previous year and a half. He'd trampled all over North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, woods and swamps, rivers and creek beds and fields, even to the Midwest frontier and back, to near the present-day communities of White Oak and Mulmire. He'd faced hurricanes of grape and canister, and incoming rifle fire that filled the air like a swarm of bees. He'd run at the enemy, away from the enemy, and hidden from both friend and foe as circumstances required, although telling one from the other was often difficult. If nothing else, Wright was a survivor, no easy task that year. So that story was passed down, and this is again something I only found when I started on the book. That story was passed down, and the lady that gave me the information had talked to my great uncle And he passed that story to her. I had never heard it until she gave it to me. So that's kind of where that information came from. But it got me to thinking, when we started doing research and I started looking these guys up, his wife, Sally Ann, could not read or write. And even on the Confederate pension in the early 1900s, she was still signing with an X. So she had no idea what had happened to him. The last thing anybody had seen about him was he was missing at Gettysburg. And I think that was the last thing that was printed in a publication anywhere. She couldn't have read it. Somebody would have had to read it to her. And there's no letters back home because in the census before the Civil War, he couldn't read or write either. Now, after the Civil War, the first census after, he is listed as literate after that. I think he learned from his captain, which we might talk about in a little bit, who was a school teacher. So there's no letters. He didn't leave anything behind. There was a family Bible with comings and goings, births and deaths, but that was pretty much it. Let's see, I mentioned the courthouse and all that. I think that's the next one. So to give you an idea of where I grew up and where this man was from, here's a neat old map I found of the counties around where I lived. Let's see here if I can hit the right button. There we go. Is the red light up there? Maybe I'm not hitting the right thing here. There we go. So that's Nashville. That's sort of in the center of the county. And so I live right about through here, and he lived right about there. And then if you want to kind of get perspective, that's Nash County, not far from the border of Virginia. All right, so Eastern North Carolina people are sort of the main focus of the book. And the book is really about it's got famous people in it, but it's really about the common people during the Civil War. And Kevin and I were talking about this, and I was joking about it. We really had an interesting conversation. There's all these similarities between North and South, and I think that's kind of the whole point. But we were talking about that, and I was thinking about when I was growing up, so when I was a kid with that Civil War book, I wanted to read about the generals and the leaders and all that stuff, and I was interested in the battles, and all those things were interesting to me, and they still are. But as I've gotten older, seeing how the common people lived has really become something interesting to me. And I think that's one of those things, if we look at that, I think it makes history more humanizing, and we can relate to it a little bit better if we start talking about, what were the people more like us, not just the famous people. And then the other conclusion, and I mentioned this in the early part of the book, is I never thought about this growing up. I always thought the history was kind of the complete story. So when you read about a war or a battle, you were kind of getting the complete story. And I certainly learned from researching this book, there is no such thing. We never get the whole story. It's never completely presented. It's always got something missing. And I didn't really think about it until I was older. I really think about that. And that history isn't as far removed if we can connect it to common people, especially if we're related to them. And I think that's why people are so interested in genealogy. And, I know it got more popular during the pandemic. Kevin mentioned in the introduction that we used to have a photography studio. And one of the things we did a lot of was copying and restoring old photos for people. And Christy can tell you that there's a certain age that people would get to is when we would get those photos. Like it was never the 20-somethings that brought the photos in. It was the late 40s, early 50s. And they would bring old photos in, and sometimes it would be sketches from during the Civil War era, and sometimes it was things from 50 years before. Sometimes this is the only picture of my granddaddy. And I started realizing how valuable that stuff becomes, but you got to get a little older, I think, before that stuff, you realize how valuable those things are. And so I kind of thought about all of those things while I was putting this together and chasing this fella. Okay, so I knew this was Rocky Mount, Virginia. We live not far from Rocky Mount, North Carolina. That's the cotton mill that was there. It's arguable whether it's the oldest or second oldest. A lot of histories say it's the second. But it operated from the early 18-teens till it closed. I believe it was 1996 is when it finally closed. Now, it doesn't look like it in this old drawing. I think that's from the 20s. But now it's upscale shopping and restaurants, fancy places to eat and drink. I think there's half a dozen microbreweries out there. They've restored a bunch of the houses. It's a pretty neat little destination now. But it was an interesting place. The Yankees, I don't talk about it a whole lot tonight, but it did get raided during the Civil War. A group came from around Kingston, came up and burned it down. One of the interesting stories from it is they were going to burn the main house down that was at the center of the mill. And it turned out the commander of Union troops, the guy that was running the mill was also from the north, and they were both Masons. and somehow they communicated that to each other. I like to think in my mind it was a secret handshake or something, right?
There's always a thing about a sign.
Yeah.
There's that story with Mosby and the whole thing about the executing of somebody.
And see, I've probably watched too many movies,
Yeah.
right? But I got this scene, the guy's riding around on his horse and he's telling them to burn stuff down, and this guy comes out, he's like, does some sign. I was like, we're not going to burn this one down.
Yep.
But that's the story, and I found it in a lot of places. But it's really interesting. And the thing you don't see in the movies is they came into town and they burned the mill down, and they went to Tarboro and burned some stuff down. And then the Union soldiers, they all walked down the street to the restaurant and had a steak. Right? They went in there and ate, and they got drunk. That was the other thing. They ate and they got drunk, and then they rode back. And then when they got a safe distance away, the Confederates that were left decided they'd chase them. They stayed just far enough back not to catch them. And then there's a funny story in there. They were going to burn the house down of a plantation owner. And I know I mentioned drinking already, but they stopped, and the man was gone. The wife was sick in bed, and the 3 young daughters came to the door and struck a bargain with the Union soldiers that they would give them all the brandy they had if they wouldn't burn the house down. So they struck a deal. So the soldiers got drunker, took the liquor, and left, didn't burn the house down. That worked out pretty all right. All right. But anyway, the area I'm from, there was not a whole lot of engagement, not a whole lot of battles. The mills was probably the biggest thing that happened in my county. It was a big supplier. They processed cotton, and cotton wasn't just used in clothes, it was also used in ammunition. So it was a pretty significant place. And this happened right around the time that Gettysburg was going on. So within a few weeks of that. All right, so just to tell you, part of what I'm writing about is North Carolina, and all states were a little different during the Civil War. I think that's one thing we don't get now when we hear the stuff about Civil War in the little short bites. I think it's fair to say from the firsthand research I did that people from Virginia didn't think of themselves as Americans from Virginia, they thought of themselves as Virginians. And North Carolinians thought of themselves as North Carolinians. And most of the people from North Carolina, and it's maybe true of Virginia too, they were joining the Confederate Army to protect North Carolina. They didn't get to do much of that. They got sent away, but that was kind of the mindset. So I talk a lot about how the states were different, particularly how North Carolina was different. North Carolina had the nickname, I don't know if you've ever heard it, but we were called the Rip Van Winkle State. So if you're not familiar with that story, it was kind of like a place that went to sleep and then woke up and didn't want to progress. So we had a lot of leaders. It sounds almost like I'm talking about modern times in a sense, that they wanted to stay undeveloped and backwards, and they were kind of indifferent to things that were going on in the world. They were against development. They didn't want to progress. They didn't want have a bunch of relatives. They wanted to keep the status quo. So there was a lot of folks and it's just amazing reading some of that stuff. Some of these people that were leading the state, and they're like, we don't need that. Our people don't need to learn to read like that. And it's just crazy to read something like that. But they opposed roads, railroads, public schools. They wanted to keep the status quo. So that kind of gives you an idea of how North Carolina was in the 1800s. Most of the people, this is also a little different. Most North Carolinians were small farmers. All right? There was, I think, I don't have the exact statistic on the top of my tongue. I do think I have it in here. Most people had small farms. So only 28% of the population had slaves in 1860, and then 70% of them had fewer than 10. So most of the citizens were small, white farmers who lived on small farms, made North Carolina a little different. Nash County that I showed you a picture of actually had more free blacks than slaves in 1860. All right, so North Carolina did not have much of an appetite for the war. And this was something I didn't know before I started this. I knew we were late to secede, but it's kind of interesting. Most states that seceded had a convention, and they sent delegates, and they voted for secession, obviously. North Carolina was going to have one, and I know it's going to seem weird to y'all that politicians would connive, but once they kind of saw who the delegates were going to be, they realized they didn't have the votes to secede. So they decided to not have a secession convention. And so what they did instead is the wealthy guys in the legislature decided to secede without consulting the people. So that's kind of how that started. So so North Carolina ended up seceding. The people really didn't get to vote on it. And so the war started. Most people from North Carolina were mad about Fort Sumter. They thought South Carolina had dragged us into a mess. They didn't want any part of it. Matter of fact, Lincoln wasn't on the ballot, but if you read papers from that time and opinions and letters, most people in North Carolina were like, well, let's just see what Lincoln does. All right. Well, it's kind of interesting because I think for North Carolina, there's a famous line, I've got it in the book, the governor at the time, he was definitely a secessionist, but he knew the people were not. But the turning point was when Lincoln called for troops. And so he wanted 75,000 troops. Now, Lincoln was a smart guy. He knew what was going to happen when he called for troops. I feel like he was too smart not to. But that was kind of it. And the North Carolina governor's famous quote, not long, he died in office before the war started. But his thing was, you shall get no troops from North Carolina. And that's kind of when it went sort of downhill for us. But Wright, the man in the book, he stayed out of the war for a year. And I think the only reason he joined is two things. So the draft was coming, and if you got drafted, you didn't know where you were going. But if you joined, then you could sort of pick your unit, and if you had family members, you could stay with them, members from your community. So he went to Raleigh with his brother Ruffin, and they joined the Confederate Army about a year after the war started. Not quite a year, pretty close. They trained at a place called Camp Mangum in Raleigh. All right, so they had the training there. It was kind of a wild time. Most of the people in Raleigh had never been out of the house before, as we say in North Carolina sometimes. And so there was a lot of drinking, a lot of cussing. And it's funny when you read stories about how people had never heard so much cussing in their life. I don't know how true that is, but there was also a lot of disease. And this was kind of the foreshadowing for the war. People in that camp were dying right, left of disease. Matter of fact, in Wright's unit, Company A, I think it was one of the captains died of disease in camp before he ever got out of the camp. And so they had a lot of that. And so they were sort of dragging their feet. And this is a picture of the Battle of Kingston, which is a town east of us by about 45 minutes between us and the coast. And so these units, they train them in Raleigh. And y'all have probably heard of New Bern, this Battle of New Bern. So the Yankees were down there in New Bern. And they were trying to move towards Raleigh. The whole point was to sort of follow the railroad line, get to Raleigh, take Goldsboro and these other towns. And so they would take these troops as they were getting closer into training, and they would send them down to Washington, Kingston, and New Bern, which are all kind of close together. One time they sent them down there. I don't know, again, this sounds like modern times, but one time they sent them down there with no guns. So I don't know exactly what they were supposed to do. They sent them down there with guns, and I don't know if somebody realized it. They sent them back kind of quick. They sent them back another time. Now, I know y'all get more snow than we do, but we don't get much snow in the eastern part of the state. And they sent them down there in December, and it started snowing when they sent them down there. And they told them, they got them off the train. They said, you got to go quick. We got to get to Kingston. Just leave your stuff here by the tracks. You can get it on the way back tomorrow. Well, they sent them down there. They had guns this time. They didn't do much shooting. A lot of noise made. And when they come back to get on the train, all their stuff was gone. So it's hard to believe that a government operation would result in something going wrong. So anyway, they sent them back to Raleigh. They sent them back 2 or 3 times. Never saw much combat, a little shooting here and there. They would shoot across the river down there at Washington. But that was about it, not much. So they hardly saw any action until they decided to send them through Virginia up towards Pennsylvania as Robert E. Lee was planning this invasion that sort of started at a place called Gettysburg. All right, so if you think about it, this was something I probably wouldn't have thought about when I was a kid reading about it. But think about, most of these guys never fired a weapon. Most of them probably never saw a Union soldier, and your first action is Gettysburg. And I know probably all of y'all, I'm not talking to an audience that doesn't know, I know you understand Gettysburg. Now, on the way, they saw a lot of bad things. They saw a lot of dead bodies. I think that sobered them up real quick. Because if you read the letters, they're ready to fight. They've been training. They've been yanked back and forth. They're ready to fight. And I think they were ready to go until they started marching through Virginia and seeing where all this stuff had already happened. And they're seeing body parts and dead animals and dead men. And I think it sobered them up pretty quick. Anyway, when they got there on the first day, and I talk about Gettysburg, it's got a pretty good section in here on what happened at Gettysburg. Morale was high. And they had that first day, they kind of stumbled into the troops. There's this one thing I did find. Has anybody ever heard the myth about them looking for shoes at Gettysburg? Yeah. I've heard songs about it. But pretty much, when I dug deep enough, that's really not true. I found that not to be true. I don't know if I'm upsetting anybody by telling you that, but they really were not looking shoes. The things that were going on, they would have known they weren't there. And they kind of stumbled into these troops, and it's kind of interesting. Another thing that you'll find hard to believe, somebody lower down the chain that was doing all the work saw all these Union troop movements and tried to report it. And the generals were like, he's just a private. He doesn't know. He's just a non-commissioned. He doesn't know all this stuff. He can't be right. And so they kind of stumbled in this thing. They didn't realize what they were walking into. So, had the first day. It was pretty chaotic, but turned out pretty good for the Confederates. John Thorpe, who was a captain in the unit, very interesting guy. He could be his own book. He was a school teacher at the time, and this is where I read a lot about him. He had a pretty distinguished career after the war, but he was with the men. He passed up several promotions during the war because he didn't want to leave his unit. And that's not all that unusual to read about, but he certainly could have taken himself out of danger many, many times. But he mentioned after the first day, I love the way he phrased, he's a wonderful writer. If you look up the troop histories, you'll see he's usually the one that wrote them 30 years after the war. And he said the men were intoxicated with victory. Now, that's a pretty good line. So big time on the first day. However, they did have very heavy casualties in Wright's unit. I probably should mention at this point, when they left Raleigh, there was about 145 of them. And then I can't remember if I mentioned this when we get to the slide, so I'll tell you now. When he walked home from Gettysburg, there was 13. 13. And not all of those guys were originals. Some of those guys were replacements. So it was 13, and then it's not exactly accurate. It was 13 enlisted men, and I think there was 2 officers left. The highest ranking was a captain, so it was like 15. All right, so really they were, first day was pretty good. They had a lot of casualties, not necessarily all of them killed, but some pretty bad injuries, a lot of wounded men, and it was so bad they didn't even use them on the second day. They kept them out of the battle on the second day, and then you'll read that they really shouldn't have been there on the third day. They brought up all the cooks. They brought up everybody they had for that third day, that disastrous third day. And so then there's an interesting character that comes through the book. His name's General James Pettigrew. He was a pretty interesting guy. He graduated from UNC when he was 16, traveled to Europe for a little while, wrote. I think he taught in college for a little while, went to South Carolina, did some work down there, came back, served in the legislature, did all that stuff before he was 25. That's a pretty full life in 25 years, but he ended up in the Confederate Army, and he was leading the men on the third day, and he was part of that disastrous charge of pickets. All right, so at one point, the men in Company A, and that's Wright's guys, they got pinned down and they couldn't go anywhere, so they couldn't go forward without getting shot behind trees and walls, and basically shot till they ran out of ammo. And so Wright and several of the guys he was with got captured. So they were taken prisoner, and that's the part I saw in that history when I first ran across Wright, was he was captured at Gettysburg and escaped. So it was hard to find exactly what happened. I did a lot of reading to sort of circle it to see how people escaped at Gettysburg, and basically it was just chaos. They would send people to the back of the line. Sometimes there wouldn't be enough people guarding them. Sometimes there'd be shooting. Sometimes there's their own people shooting at them. Him and some other guys got away, and he got back to his unit just as they were starting to retreat. So a bunch of the guys that got pinned down ended up retreating. And then here's another strange story I ran across. So Pettigrew, he's this young general. He'd already been wounded one time before, and they left him for dead. And the Union soldiers found him and did surgery on him and saved his life, and then they traded him later, which I thought was fascinating, how much trading of prisoners, like high-ranking prisoners. And so this was a general that traded him. Well, he was in the retreat, and as they were going back, a cavalry unit ran up on them. You'll see somewhere that this unit supposedly was drunk. I keep talking about alcohol a lot. Supposedly they were drunk. One of the guys saw the general, pulled a pistol, and Pettigrew pulled his. It misfired. This guy's didn't, and shot him in the stomach, which is a pretty lethal thing. So Pettigrew's men were trying to convince him, let us put you somewhere and let you be captured again, and he wouldn't let them do it. They ran out. A strange story happened after that. The guy that shot him took off, and some of Pettigrew's men followed him, chased him into a barn, and then beat him to death with a rock. It's just one of those bizarre stories. I mean, you wonder, did they run, they just take off and run out of ammo? How does it come to be? Or was it intentionally brutal? I don't know. I never could find that much of it out. I found that part. But anyway, Pettigrew wouldn't let his men leave him. He ended up dying 3 days later. All right. Well, there's another slide here somewhere. Let's see. What have I done, Kevin? There we go.
There you go.
Thank you. I might not be holding my tongue right.
Definition of insanity is you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result.
Well, that's true. But I tell you what, I found out the exception to that rule is computers. I have found it.
My insane people.
I have found at Barton where I work, I can put my password in 6 times and it not work, and it'll go that 7th time, same password. Very strange. I think the IT guy's got something against me. I don't know. All right, so A.P. Hill, I know most of y'all probably heard of him, kind of interesting guy. He was leading the men at Bristoe Station. All right, so this was October. Really hadn't seen much action since Gettysburg. It was this long retreat. He had performed really well early in the war, had a pretty good reputation, but there was a guy he did not get along with going all the way back to West Point. You might have heard of Stonewall Jackson. They did not like each other at all. It kept getting worse and worse, even though they were both having successes. And it came to a head in Maryland when Lee invaded Maryland. Jackson actually had Hill arrested. He thought Hill was incompetent and just kept getting lucky. And Hill was kind of I don't want to say a party guy, but he was a little bit more loose. Stonewall was sort of uptight. And so he didn't like a bunch of foolishness. Hill didn't mind it. That was part of the problem. And he actually was bringing up Hill on court-martial charges, and the only reason that feud went away is because Jackson got killed at Chancellorsville. Otherwise, Hill might have been done a little sooner. Matter of fact, he had him arrested one time on a march and had him detained and only decided to release him at the last minute because he was worried what they were going to do. They needed Hill. All right. Well, all that went out the door at Bristoe Station. I love that artwork that they have on the page here. I had not seen that until you posted it. I love that. But Bristoe Station was a debacle from the start. So the Confederates had retreated into Virginia, and they'd stopped over the rest at Orange Courthouse, which is another place I kind of had to stop at. I met my wife in college, and she's got people from Orange Courthouse, and I got to thinking about it's kind of interesting to think that our folks could have crossed paths 150 years before. It's just kind of interesting, but the two armies, they were both looking, Union and Confederate armies, they were both looking somewhere to hang out in the winter. And they were now in October, starting to get a little cold. They're trying to figure out what to do. So Lee saw an opportunity when the Union sent a bunch of the troops to Tennessee. So Union sent a bunch of troops to Tennessee. Lee thought maybe this was a chance to push back. And so he said he saw a less imposing force, and so he went after him at Bristoe Station. Now, the problem was Hill, when he got there, he was a little ahead of things. He didn't realize that he was greatly outnumbered. So he sent General Kirkland, who was now in charge of the 47th, he sent them to attack at Bristoe Station, and they stumbled into 2 corps and attacked without doing all the reconnaissance. And so this was a disaster. They went right into entrenched positions with no reinforcements. So there was total chaos, disaster. And for the men of the 47th and the other units, it was kind of like a deja vu from Gettysburg. They almost found themselves in the same spot. Here they got their leaders telling them, running right straight into this grape and canister. And they decided they already done that one time. They didn't want to do that again. And so they were ordered to go in this suicidal position, and about 40 of them, and Wright was one of them, decided we can do better than that, and they came up with their own plan. Instead of doing another Pickett's charge, they came up with a strategy to flank the Union and shoot into their backside, and it worked for a little while. Worked pretty well. The problem was the other units didn't follow them. And so pretty soon, the Union had them flanked and pinned down, started using grape and canister, decimated the 47th and some other units. But they refused to retreat, kind of that same thing. If they retreat, that would have been just as much suicide as running into them. So they just held their place until they ran out of bullets. And there was really not much else for them to do shooting-wise. So Wright and the rest of those guys surrendered. And this time there was no way to escape. So what I wanted to do for just a second is read a little just a small part of the section about Bristoe Station, give you a feel for it. Excuse me. The brigade marched on for the rest and refit at Orange Courthouse in Virginia. Brigadier General William Kirkland, promoted just weeks before from colonel, took over the brigade in September. Several wounded members of Company A returned along with Wright and others who had escaped or been separated, and new recruits arrived as replacements. By October, the Army of Northern Virginia had taken up defense near the Rapidan River, while federal forces were aligned nearby on the Rappahannock River. Lee was trying to turn Meade's right flank and advance on Washington, D.C. On October 9th, they marched towards Culpeper. Both armies were weary from Gettysburg, and with winter coming on, were maneuvering for position to launch spring campaigns. The Union Army sent reinforcements along the Blue Ridge to Chattanooga, and General Lee learned he was now facing a less imposing force. He attacked Meade's force across the Rapidan, moving them back towards Centerville and Bristoe Station. General Heath's division was ordered by General A.P. Hill, who did not realize he was greatly outnumbered, to engage the Union force there. Cook's brigade retired, and then Kirkland overtook General Gouverneur K. Warren, who had distinguished himself at Gettysburg at Little Round Top and was in charge of a corps of Meade's army. Kirkland attacked without reinforcements directly into entrenched Union positions with both flanks exposed. The Battle of Bristoe Station ensued. The battle opened early in the afternoon of October 14th. An early shell burst took out 15 men of the 47th. A group of about 40 skirmishers, including Wright, refused to join the battle lines when they started overlapping. These men didn't run, but they refused to be part of yet another suicide charge that claimed so many of their friends at Gettysburg. The scene was familiar and seemed like Cemetery Ridge all over again. This time the men adjusted and formed their own plan of attack. They crossed in front of the brigade and surged around the 82nd New York. The 11th North Carolina followed, and then part of the 52nd did too. They managed to fire into the flank and rear of the New Yorkers, but the success was temporary. The Federals loaded canister rounds, and after the bloody mess in Pennsylvania, many men were, to quote a letter I found, unwilling to expose themselves. They retired or took cover in the barns of the locals, as well as some huts in an overrun Federal camp. General Heath was captured. Kirkland was wounded. Soon the attack stalled and was doomed. The 47th had marched 14 miles that day and had not eaten, and the men were flanked and ordered to retreat. To do so, they would have to cross open ground under heavy fire, which would have been suicidal. This had been proven several times. With Pickett's disaster fresh on their mind, many men refused to move and held their ground. There was chaos. And there's this firsthand account that I found from a Thomas Riley, who was a private in the 47th. Nearly every man of a strong voice was bawling out something of which I could distinguish the following: cease fire, lie down, don't shoot, you are shooting our own men, charge, fall back, and the like, so that it was impossible to recognize the voice of our commander unless very near him, said Thomas Bailey. I said Riley, I meant to say Bailey, a private in the 47th. 2 brigades were slaughtered. It was a great blunder on the part of A.P. Hill, Captain Thorpe wrote. Lieutenant Sidney Bridgers, who I'd mentioned earlier in the book, he was in the 47th, he was killed. Wright and several men of the Chikura Guards were soon surrounded and forced to surrender, and this time there would be no escape. Confederate losses at Bristoe Station were over 1,300, with a lot of men missing. The 47th, they'd already been decimated at Gettysburg. They were now had 5 killed and 37 wounded. Bristoe Station was another disaster, and A.P. Hill took the blame from Lee, the men, and the newspapers. It is not known whether Sally Batchelor had heard about the list of casualties from Company A reported in October 28, 1863 edition of the Daily Progress in North Carolina. It listed G.W. Westry as severely wounded in the thigh, and Lieutenant Bridgers was mortally wounded. Captain Chambly was wounded severely in the hip. It's interesting how specific some of these were. And they go on and list, and then they listed Wright as missing. Captain Thorpe wrote in his notes, "It may be that a kind providence had heard prayers for union that has ascended both sides, though uttered not so loud from the south, and in answer just wrote down in the book of fate, Gettysburg, 3 July, 1863, the beginning of the end." For Wright and several of his fellow soldiers, the war was getting ready to take crazy turns. For the remaining men, the rest of the war would be a series of privations and frustrations. So they took Wright and they sent him to, that was part I just read you, they sent him to this prison here. First he went to Old Capitol, and then they sent him to Point Lookout, which is in Maryland. This is probably nice beachfront property now. It was a terrible place to be in 1863. You can see the hospital down there at the tip. But the prisoners were in here. The Union, Secretary of War Stanton had decided that he was going to teach these rebels a lesson. They had the money to build barracks, but he refused to supply barracks, so they had to live in tents. They put more men in a tent than you were supposed to have. They put them close to the water, so high tide they would get wet. They only had one blanket, so if you only got one blanket, you got two choices. You can sleep in the dirt and wrap yourself up. You can sleep on top of it, or you can sleep with somebody else. And that's what they did. They snuggled up. You don't see those stories either, right? And then there's all kinds of stories that you'll find about what went on in this prison camp. It was terrible. Food was bad. Local citizens felt so bad for them. Now, there was a lot of Southern sympathizers. They tried to bring them food and clothing. Union wouldn't let them do it, wouldn't let them give anything to the prison camp. There's stories of Union guards going out in the middle of the night and running them out of their tents and making them run laps through the streets of the prison camp. You'll read stories about there was black guards here, black troops were here, and supposedly they were given a bounty for every Confederate they shot trying to escape. And so they would try to goad them into escaping. They would tell them they had written letters to their sisters. All kinds of stuff going on here. So men were dying every day. And so, we hear about the terrible Southern prisons that were awful. There's one in Salisbury. Of course, Andersonville. Well, this was right up there. This wasn't much better. Thousands of people died. People are dying every day getting hauled out of there. So the Union came up with this idea that they did a little informal survey of the soldiers and wanted to know if they had a chance to join Union Army or Navy to get out of the camp, would they do it? And a lot of them said they would. And so these troops became known as Galvanized Yankees. All right, and so you can read a little bit about them. It's kind of interesting. And so one of the definitions of galvanized is when you cover something up, but what's there stays underneath. All right, and so that's what they did. Now, the interesting thing, I don't think you can see it in this image, but they had them, where they had them training, the prisoners could see these galvanized guys training. So you can imagine how that went over, a lot of heckling back and forth. Wright and a couple of his men, he decided to do, one of the themes of the book is survival. And so one thing he was good at, he would do whatever he needed to do to survive. And so he joined the Union Army, and a couple of other guys did. Part of the problem, I think, that's going to come back later is not all the guys did. Not all the guys he was in the unit with, and I think that's going to cause them some problems later, despite the other things he did. You can help me put it together. Anyway, they got mustered into the U.S. Volunteers. First U.S. Volunteers was the unit. All right? And so they started out sending them to the Tidewater area in Virginia. They briefly sent them down to Elizabeth City, which isn't far from there. And then they decided this might not be a great idea to send former Confederate soldiers back to the South. All right, what are they going to do? Are they going to decide to start shooting Union soldiers in the back? And then also Grant had this thought of, if they get caught, they're going to be considered deserters and they could be shot or hanged. And so there was that danger. And he decided it was a bad idea. If they really wanted to get some use out of them, they should send them out west. All right? And so out west then would have been considered, in at least Wright's case, St. Louis and Milwaukee. And so they put them on a train, and they sent Wright's unit up to Fort Reno, which I have not been able to find any photos from the area, from that area or sketches, but sent them to Fort Reno, Milwaukee. And the rest of them went to St. Louis, and they were supposed to go out there and defend the frontier from the Indians. All right. So they sent Wright out there to fight the Indians. He wasn't really crazy about that either. So he took his paycheck and took a walk. And he started walking back south. Now, at the last minute, I found out, when I say the last minute, the book was in the copy editing stages, and a friend had found the name, another historian had found the names of the guys he walked off with. And so there's no record. The only one of those four that there's a record of is Wright. They disappeared after that. And then one thing that drove me crazy, and maybe I shouldn't admit this, there was a name of one of those guys. I couldn't find him anywhere, couldn't find a record of him anywhere. And then I finally found out that his name, he was a foreign soldier. I think he was from Poland. And so there was a name they gave all soldiers from Poland. And that's why I couldn't find this guy, because there was about 100 other guys with the same name. It was kind of like calling somebody John. It's like a John Doe kind of thing. And that was a whole other thing. It was another a wormhole to fall into. I tried to stay out of that one. Anyway, he took his pay. And so one of the more interesting things I found was this document right here, which lists all the things he deserted with. And so I thought it was pretty interesting because it lists that he walked off with a rifle, the uniform he was wearing, and I think my favorite part is that even charged him for the little I that was sewn on the sleeve for the number 1. They had that itemized on what he owed. And so they were looking to get $28.02 out of him if they could ever catch up with him. And that was one of my favorite things I found. That was in the archives in Raleigh. If they ever caught up with him, he owed him $28. But it's a pretty good deal because he got a rifle and some clothes out of it, right? And got that little 1. All right. So anyway, he took his pay, started walking back. Now here's where it gets interesting. What are you going to do? He's walking back from Milwaukee. So I don't know how good y'all's geography is. That's right good ways from Nash County, especially on foot. Now, there was a theory, I had talked to some people about it, that he could have gone to Canada and got on a blockade runner, but wouldn't have been likely at this point in a war. So we're talking about he walked back. So he's having to hide now from 2 armies, right? Because he's a Confederate deserter, and he's also a Union deserter. And then that was a whole other interesting thing about how they handled deserters. So sometimes if you were a Confederate and you deserted, they might shoot you. And then sometimes they might hang you. And then depending on what the circumstances were, they might say, just go get back in your tent. And so you never knew exactly what was going to happen. But so he's having to move at night, hide during the day and move at night because he's got to avoid 2 groups that are now looking for him. And so I wished he had left some paperwork behind because I would have loved to know what the man was thinking. Because what he's doing is he's hiding in barns, he's hiding in the woods. Are these people sympathizers? Because some of the places he's crossing through, they're not solid Union places, but he's got to find his way back. So this is where it gets interesting to me too, is there's a point when you're coming back from Milwaukee, you can take that right turn and go back to North Carolina, or you can try to find your unit. And so I'm thinking, what was his thought process? There's already men that have seen him wearing a Union uniform and drilling that he lives down the road from at home. He's got to live with those folks if he survives the war, right? So if he shows up a year early, of course, they didn't know when it was going to end at this point, but if he shows up early, how's that going to work out? And then the other thing is if he goes back to his unit where they were at that wonderful place called Petersburg, that didn't work out so hot either, right? And so for some reason, I do explore some theories in here, he ends up getting back to Petersburg just in time to see him blow that big hole, the crater. Just got there just in time for it. And his brother was there. So he went back and rejoined his unit. And I'm not positive. Again, this is trying to put pieces together. But him and his brother were in the same company, in the same unit. And his brother, once Wright got captured and went to prison, his brother transferred. And I've always felt like that was to get, that word had gotten back that he had joined the Union Army. I feel like that was why, is that, let's not be in that situation and take a beating that's meant for my brother. So anyway, he goes back to that unit. His brother gets captured at Petersburg, and he gets sent to Elmira, New York, another terrible prison camp. And Wright goes all the way back to Appomattox, and he's there for the surrender, and when they stack the weapons. And, we all read those stories, of them lining up, and you get all this sort of glorious picture. And then if you dig and read the first-hand accounts, it was kind of like, all right, war's over. Well, let's go home. And so they fed them, and then that Sunday, a bunch of them just took off walking. How else are they going to get home? Railroad's been destroyed. They don't get their horse. And so what was interesting was I found a diary from a guy in a little community close to Nashville called Sandy Cross. There's still a store there with that guy's name on it. And about 50 years after the war, he transcribed to somebody right before he died what he did in the war. And part of it was his walking back from Appomattox. Now, this was interesting to me, 135 miles. How long do y'all think it took him to walk back? Anybody got a guess? I was doing the same thing she's doing. I was trying to figure out how many could you go in a day. Well, y'all are right on it. I'm the dumb one then. I was thinking it would take much longer to walk. I was thinking about my pace, I guess, how long it would take me to walk back. It took him about a week. And it was fascinating. This guy, it was interesting. And the reason I'm pretty sure they walked back together, because if you look at all the rosters, he said and it's interesting, the guy that wrote it didn't name any, there's no other names in it besides his name. He doesn't mention the name of anybody. Now, part of it might have been that by the time he did this, he was in his early 80s, I believe. So that could have been part of it. But when he talks about the size of the group, and then you look at the records and see how many guys were left from that area, Wright's in that group. I mean, it's a big enough group that it's the same guys. And so they're walking back. And I think I mentioned to you that if you ever look at the roster, I found an old book in another discard pile, and it was a list of everybody that was at Appomattox that surrendered. And you look at some of those units, I think I mentioned to you there was like 13 enlisted men in his unit that made it back, and a couple of non-commissioned, and then the captain, and one, I believe there's one lieutenant. You'll see some groups, there's like 3 or 4 names. That's all that's left out of these 150-man groups. And so they're walking back. And the story of them walking back was interesting. They would stop off, and it'll say, we stopped off at a woman's house whose son had just got back, and she was so thankful that she didn't have much, but she fed us. Let us slept in the barn. And the next day they stopped somewhere else. And it was like, preacher so-and-so and his family hadn't heard word of their son. And so they fed us. And it was just interesting how they worked their way back as a group. They got to one point, and there was 2 freed blacks that were running a ferry. Can you imagine how that looked? You know, here's 2 guys trying to make a nickel, getting men across on a ferry, or women, or whoever wants to get across, and then here's 30 Confederates. And they took them across. Had no problem. Guy wrote, there was no problem. Once we assured them we meant them no harm, there was no problem. And so the saddest part to me is they get back. When I showed you that map, there was Nash County, and then there's a county above it, Warren County. This was kind of the saddest part of that guy's writing. He says, when we got to Warren County, it was time for some of us to part ways. And that's when some men realized they had nowhere to go. Home was no longer there. They realized that, you know, what they were going back to had been burned down, the people had died, the people had moved on. That was pretty sad. And that goes back to that humanizing thing about, you know, you don't hear those stories about the generals, right? You know, these guys went back, and a bunch of them realized they didn't have anything to go back to. All right, so it took them about a week to get home. And then this is before the surrender in Durham. All right, and that's the picture of that. That's Johnston surrendering to Sherman. So anyway, Wright comes home, and I mentioned that lawlessness thing that was going on, and that was one of the concerns about letting the soldiers, when they were talking about letting the guys go home with their guns, that was one of the concerns, not just of the Union Army, but Johnston was worried that some of these guys would form gangs and become outlaws. You know, and we saw it, right? I mean, we got some famous outlaws. I mean, Jesse James's crew it's kind of a version of that. So we talked about how they were worried about that, so they weren't sure, and that was part of the negotiation. It's real interesting that Sherman didn't do much destruction in North Carolina. I think he burned the arsenal at Fayetteville, and I believe that was it. Burned a little bit of stuff in Fayetteville, didn't burn anything else. And if you'll look in history, you won't see very many Confederate generals from North Carolina, not very many notable ones. Confederacy didn't trust them. Well, it kind of paid off when Sherman came to town, because he said, well, you know, we're sure about these folks. And one of the things I found that will add to that is the Union tried to have an election in eastern North Carolina. Lincoln had this idea that if he could get some of the counties to elect a senator, and they could seat a senator in Congress, that North Carolina would give up the war. And he had some pretty good support for that. Zebulon Vance was governor of North Carolina. His motto was fuss with the Confederacy and fight the Union. Him and the governor of Georgia issued more exemptions from people not being drafted than any other Confederate state. And so there was reason to think that. Of course, the election didn't happen, but Lincoln was kind of trying to backdoor North Carolina back into the Union. And that's kind of been some of the reason why Sherman didn't destroy North Carolina. And then the other thing I think that was interesting is Sherman, who you could make a case was a war criminal, offered better terms of surrender than actually took place. When word got back to Lincoln and Stanton and Grant of the terms that Sherman had offered Johnston, they sent Grant down to relieve Sherman. that you can't do this way, you let them off too easy. And so they changed the terms. They ended up, it's really interesting. I had never seen this before until I saw the first-hand document. There was 2 terms of surrender. They had Johnston sign one, and then he signed another one, so they could show that they had done what they wanted, but they really didn't do it. And so it was kind of interesting. I mean, you actually see, I'd never seen that anywhere, that there was, I know it seems weird to talk about somebody having 2 sets of books, but that's kind of what they did, right? All right, so Wright got home, war's over, he goes back to farming, took up his old job of running the county poorhouse, and that whole concept is interesting. That's in North Carolina, they became county homes, but they were called the poorhouse back then. And that's where if you were mentally disabled, too old to work, unable to work for some reason, you could go live there and you still had to work if you couldn't support yourself. So he was in charge of that. He was superintendent of that. He became a radical Republican. He ran for the very prestigious office of coroner. And he lost by, I think it was 6 votes, either 6 or 7 votes. And when I tell that, people are like, man, what in the world? Well, that was a different kind of office, and it did kind of do the coroner stuff like we think of now, but it had quite a few political perks. But I love it because one of the conventions they had, this doesn't seem at all like modern politics. They said they nominated a sheriff, they nominated a coroner, and then a row broke out, and then a fist fight, and we had to leave. So I don't know. I guess they eventually ended up finishing their slate of officers, but they had a fist fight and couldn't finish that night anyway. But here's the thing. So there were definitely people that had seen Wright in a Union uniform. There was people that knew he had been a Union soldier. Even though he went back to the Confederate Army, I feel pretty sure there was some resentment about it. I'm not so sure that's why I didn't know he was related to me. It might have been, that was one of those shameful secrets. I don't know.
Family didn't talk about it.
As much as family was talked about in my family and the importance of it, I just can't believe he was never mentioned. And I don't know. Nobody's ever been able to give me an answer about it. All right. So he was running the poorhouse. And as you know, they had livestock, they had crops, and they had this dog that was killing chickens. So Wright, he's a pretty good shot, so he knew the dog was killing chickens, so he sat and waited for him one night, and he took care of his chicken killing problem. He dispatched the dog. It was a yellow dog. That'll come up again in a minute. All right. So this was the Nash County Courthouse, and I believe that one right there was the jail, and that's the courthouse, as best I've been able to determine. He used to have to go to the courthouse pretty frequently on poorhouse business. It's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He comes out one day, and this young man steps around the corner. He's the guy the dog belonged to. He steps up to Wright, and I'm sure Wright didn't take him seriously because I believe he was 17 or 18 at the time. He pulls out a gun, and he shoots my great-granddaddy in the neck and kills him. Witnesses all around, everywhere. Shoots him and takes off running. All right? So, the headlines were, case of a yaller dog. Not a yellow, but a yaller dog. That's the headlines you would see. Now, here's the thing. That boy's daddy was at Point Lookout and did not join the Union Army. So I feel like that plays a role in this. It's not just about a dog. But anyway, he shot him. He was he took off running, but it didn't take him but a minute to catch him. I mean, it's right in the middle of town, and there's a list of witnesses. And so they know who it is. They put him in jail. Lynch mob comes for him that night. All right, well, the sheriff gets word the lynch mob is coming, so he takes him over to Wilson County, which is just one county over, really close to where I live now. And so that's where they locked him up. And then this is where the research trail got really cold for me because I could not find an accurate report of where the trial took place. So I found a newspaper that said the trial took place in Edgecombe County. So if you're thinking, this is Nash, this is Wilson, this is Edgecombe. So one said the trial took place in Edgecombe. Another paper said it took place in Nashville. And then another one said, I didn't find the Wilson one to start off with, so I couldn't figure out where he was, couldn't find him in a newspaper search. So I went to the archives and I called the courthouse, see if they had the records. And you can imagine the look on a girl's face when you walk in the records office and you say, would you have murder records? And she says, well, certainly. What year are you looking? And I say, 1884. And she knew me, and she said, you just need to leave, right? And so then everybody's looking around the corner. And so we asked if they still had the records. Everybody thought they'd been destroyed. They said, well, they're down in the basement, with the mice and the possums and everything else. And I knew they didn't want to go down there. They told me they'd probably been destroyed from flooding. I called the records office when I was looking at election results, And they couldn't understand why anybody would want election results. They want the most recent election. So that was kind of another dead end. Couldn't find the records there. Went to Raleigh and found them in the archives. All the court records. If you've never read court records from the 1800s, you should, because they are fascinating. I've got the transcript in here, but there's a line in there. I love it. The opening statement from the prosecuting attorney was something along the lines of, with the spirit and eyes of the devil, the guy's name was Lemon Rackley, did thus commit murder. And it's fascinating the way it's written. There's no testimony in the records, just the statements of the prosecutor.
Victorian prose.
It's great. Lots of misspelling, though. But really interesting that the idea was there, right? So anyway, they moved him to Wilson. That's where they had the trial. Those records were fascinating in the archives. They really weren't in order. They were just kind of bound in a book. And I was telling Kevin before, like, you'd see a thing, and it looked like somebody had taken a brown bag, like you'd put your groceries in, and put on there, arrest Mike Brantley, the sheriff, right? And then that's the arrest warrant. And so there was all kinds of stuff like that. So it was kind of a wild goose chase looking for it, but I found it. So the trial was in Wilson. The trial was sort of a sham trial. I won't tell you too much about that. I don't want to give everything away, but it's crazy about the trial. It just had an interesting twist of how it ended, but clearly it was more to it than a dog killing chickens. Maybe now, I don't know. These times are kind of crazy, right? All right. So I know I'm probably getting out of time here. All right, so I guess the way I would wind it down, there's other things in here. So we followed this guy through the war, and we talk about North Carolina in the war and how some of the other states line up. But then there's this other thing I don't think we get, and that's the thing I always like to talk about when I do this, is to think about, what you see on TV and what we hear about the Civil War is really not the story. There's this thing, and there's a chapter about presentism where you try to take how we think today and apply it to a different part of history. And it just doesn't work out, because if you go back and read what these people were writing, the Civil War was more complicated than I thought. I mean, I found papers from people who owned slaves, gave speeches about how we need to preserve slavery, and then they would write in their private notes, this is a sin, this is wrong, we got to do something about it. They're doing one, and it's crazy to think a politician do one thing in public and do another thing somewhere else. But I saw it countless times where they were, they'd say one thing, sort of do something else, and it's all complicated. They had these complicated beliefs. They do one thing that makes them sound like this person is one thing, and then there's another, there's something else. I talk about how the Civil War is kind of being fought still today, like the monuments. And I don't want to step on a landmine talking about monuments, but when we talk about the ones in North Carolina, like how they got started in North Carolina, I've never heard this story told. But, a bunch of Confederates were buried in a cemetery in Raleigh. And so every year after the war, their family members would go put stuff on the graves, put flowers on the graves. Well, during Reconstruction, one of the generals decided they were going to stop doing that. And so he ordered guards there, and if you see somebody trying to put something on a grave, shoot them. All right? So that's pretty rough. That's pretty rough. All right, well, then that wasn't enough. Then he decided that Confederates were traitors, dig them all up and get them out of there, and we're not going to help you do it. So your family's got to get your body out of there. So they had the families go dig up the bodies. So, these folks are trying to figure out what to do, and that's how the monuments got started in North Carolina. It was some way to honor them. They had to dig up those bodies, or the Union soldiers were going to dig them up after a certain point and just throw them in a pile somewhere. You don't hear that story. And, that's a little different sometimes in the narrative. Again, I'm not trying to defend monuments or destroy them. I'm just saying I like to have the whole story, and then we can all kind of determine what we want to think. I do use this quote from Shelby Foote: the Civil War defined us as what we are, opening us to what we became, good and bad. It was a crossroads of our being, and a hell of a crossroads. And that's about as good a summing up I think I can find. And then, this thing I was kind of just talking about. I like all of history. It's ugly and it's dirty and it's messy, but I think you got to tell the whole truth as close as you can get. I think she had it when she said we cannot and must not try to erase the past merely because it doesn't fit the present. All right, I'm going to try to get through this quick. I know I've run over. I apologize. I wanted to mention to y'all, I had mentioned this to Kevin, there's a place in North Carolina called Broadfoot. I mentioned it earlier. It's if you're in the Civil War, it's worth a little day trip when they have one of their sales. I've got a blog called History Pie on my website. You can subscribe for free. I try to put undertold stories on it. The one that came, today's Thursday, so I had one come out at 11 o'clock this morning, and it's about the other Robert J. Lee. I don't know if anybody ever heard of him? He was a fancy guy that was a Civil War captain, and he didn't surrender. He went back to Texas and started his own little war. Pretty interesting little story. And then I think a couple of weeks ago I had about the conspiracy theory that John Wilkes Booth got away. Y'all probably heard those. Have you ever heard the one that the guy, they supposedly thought he was this guy that showed up in Texas, and when he died, they mummified him, and some guy took him on tour and made money off selling people. I forgot how much they paid to see John Wilkes Booth. And he had a broken leg. The only problem was not the same leg that Booth broke, but they overlooked little inconvenient things like that when they were selling it. But those are the kind of things I put on there, so I'd love for you to read it. It's free. There's no catch to that. And I just mentioned I got help from so many librarians. I know we talk about technology and how great it is, but there was a couple things I never found online, and I had librarians find things for me, and even after they found them and showed them to me and I had them in my hand, I never did find any trail of that online. And so librarians were invaluable. North Carolina Archives are great. The library at UNC. Your library probably has a genealogy room. And it's not, and I'll admit, when I was a kid, I probably thought genealogy was just finding out who you related. There's so much more than just tracing your ancestors. I don't know what I would have done without all the genealogy stuff, confirming people, confirming dates. That's just a little piece of what that page looks like. And then I had mentioned this. One of Wright's daughters married. He worked for a little while as an overseer. His daughter married one of the sons of that woman. I didn't find that out until after the book came out. And then some of the families involved in the murder intermarried. And then I couldn't resist putting this in there. Confederate widows got pensions. Y'all might remember a guy from my area, Alan Gurganus, wrote The Last Confederate Widow Tells All. He's a nice guy. He's still around. He's from Rocky Mount. So he wrote about that, but they were still paying pensions. North Carolina's last one was paid in 1986 in my hometown at Spring Hope. She collected for 50 years. And last payment, she died in 1986. I didn't know her, but I think my parents did. I don't think they knew she was getting a Confederate pension, because I think I would have heard it or overheard it at some point. All right, that's all. If anybody got questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. Sorry to rip through that last part so fast and realize I'd run so long.
When you were doing your research for some of this, were there any, shall we say, things from the actual soldiers or
yes.
colonels and things like that?
Yes, that was.
Because I know, unfortunately, I've tried to research sometimes some things where Sabine Pass, the guys at Fort Griffin, they're mostly Irish immigrants.
Right.
Now, many of them aren't literate.
Right.
So you're not going to find always a lot. But yet a lot of the soldiers, that if they had, an 8th grade education in those days, they could outright a college student.
Absolutely.
And so I'm saying some of them were quite literate.
Well, and I tell you, that was the most interesting stuff. Captain Thorpe, who was the teacher, I found it accidentally. I was looking for some stuff at the library at UNC, and just saw it. Just was this, ordinary looking entry, but it turned out to be a letter he wrote to one of his cousins. And it was kind of funny. I guess we forget that people. I guess you could marry your cousin pretty frequently back then. Yeah. And it was a little flirtatious. Mm-hmm. But it was this great letter. He had drawn a little sketch of somewhere they had been. I guess that would be censored now if you did something like that. Mm-hmm. He wouldn't call Lincoln by name. He called him the Black Hat. Oh. And I thought that was pretty interesting. It took a minute to figure it out. That's what he was talking about. And there was a line in there. He said something about the boon has not yet been granted us. And he was talking about all the times they were jerking them back and forth and they hadn't been into combat. And they were ready to go. They were tired of practicing and marching and drilling. But it's just so insightful. There was a congressman I'd mentioned. Matter of fact, he even had a theory. And he was going to give a speech. I don't think he ever gave it. But he said, we should get rid of slavery. Now, he had slaves. And he was in favor of secession. And he said, we should do what Massachusetts did. Phase out slavery. Phase out slavery over 20 years. He said it worked for them. It probably worked for us. But he never said that publicly. But it was in his notes. And his notes were buried in a file that was buried in a box. And I think that's what happens sometimes is that some of those things, the most interesting stuff is buried so deep, the average person won't find it. Unless you're a nerd and go looking for stuff like that, You might not see it, but that was the most interesting. I think that was what changed so much about how I thought about the Civil War. Was this is what the book says, and this is what the people on TV are saying. This is what the people that lived through it said. Yeah. And they don't always line up. Sometimes they do, but they don't always line up.
That's true today.
It is.
What the politicians say and the ordinary folks say.
Right. You got that right. Anything else? Yeah.
Well, I know there was the murder, and like you have a theory there.
Yeah.
He might have been shot because we were aside for a while. But why did he come back to his hometown? Was there any other problems, like did people resent him and say, hey, you guys fought for the Union for a while? I mean, it sounded like he had a pretty good job. He ran the
Yeah, it was really interesting. He was, he was a guy that didn't start with a whole lot. Nobody, I've not been able to find any evidence of slaves or big property, but every time he would make $1, he would buy land, it looked like, if you go back and look at the census. And it's interesting, there's terms you have to learn when you go digging back through this stuff. So when I read his obituary, he kept being referred to as a clever man. And so when we think of clever now, I don't think we think of it the same way they meant it. When clever then meant a smart guy who was a success at business. I mean, I had to get somebody to kind of interpret some legal terms. There's legal terms that were used in the trial. Man, I didn't know what the heck that was. And it was a volunteer that used to work at the archives that had retired, and she helped me find a legal book, and we went through and found all those terms that I understand. So I don't know. I mean, it looks like if you go back and look what was written about him after he died, he wasn't hated by a bunch of people. He was just hated by the wrong people. I mean, that's what it looks like to me, because when you go and look and see, you know, the Rackleys, and I almost feel bad saying it because I know so many of them, and they're good folks like now, right? It's just, just some of your folks killed mine a long time ago. But it's just, you look in there and you see, that some of those guys they were in the prison camp. They saw it happen. They chose not to do it. And so then that part is theory. I'm just guessing that was part of it. And the fact that I never heard about him, I feel like there's a reason that story wasn't passed. I mean, it's such a good story. How could you not pass that down? And I think it's got to be that Union connection. I'm thinking, the people in my area were not for the war, but they weren't exactly Unionists either. There was a lot of Unionists in North Carolina, but not really in that area. They kind of were like North Carolina's always been, just leave us alone, right? And I really think that's what it comes down to. But I definitely think that was more than just somebody's dog being shot, for sure. But I don't have anything to back it up. He didn't leave anything written behind. Thankfully, that story was passed down.
If he ever would have thought to just start over and do a new town.
I wonder. It's just like I wonder, why did he go to Petersburg? Yeah, why did he go to Petersburg, and why didn't he go home? So I don't know. He was an interesting guy. But like I said, kind of the theme of the book is survival. And I think his decisions were less political and more living to the next day. Yeah. Well, and that's a whole other part, too, I don't think gets talked about. You got in those times, the guys is the main labor force, the kids are the labor force, the wife runs the house, and then all these guys leave and say, well, I hope y'all can take care of you. I mean, I know they left things in the smokehouse, but that was a pretty scary proposition for the women, is having to do all that farm work, plus what they were already doing. And he had all these little kids, and you'll read, you might have heard of the Salisbury bread right. There was other bread rights. One of the taxes you had to pay if you were a farmer was you had to give up part of your crop. Like they would, matter of fact, if you'll read, you'll see that some of the tax collectors that took the food were more hated than the union. And then what made it worse is they come in to take 10% of your crop, and it goes and sits in a warehouse and rots and never gets to the troops. You don't get it, and the troops don't get it because somebody's not competent enough to put it on a train and send it somewhere, or put it on a wagon and get it where it needs to go, so it just rots. And there was tons of that. And you got people starving, and nobody in the army starving, at home starving, and there's all this food in the warehouse. Not like they had refrigeration. So.
How many kids did he have, and how are you related?
Yeah, so is it 11 or 12? Do you remember? I'm sorry, I can't tell you exactly. It's either 11 or 12 kids is what he had. So he had a son named Jordan, and then, so his son Jordan, and then he had a son named Van, and then my mom was the next one. So that's how I'm connected. Yeah. My mom remembers Jordan. Oh, and then, the other thing I found was, I believe it was Jordan, who was a pallbearer for the guy who prosecuted, or lack of prosecution, of the Rackley guy that did the murder. I thought that was interesting, too. I just happened to run across that. I wasn't looking for it, just a random entry when I was searching for that guy's name. So it was interesting. Nothing's a straight line when you talk about the Civil War, that's for sure. So, anything else? Yeah.
What happened to his brother?
Ruffin. Good question. He was in Elmira. He came back about, Wright got back in April. I think he got back in June. And they didn't know what happened. And that's the thing, we think about now. You know where somebody, right? And they held them longer. They didn't let them go from the prison camps as fast. And that's the thing I'm thinking, there's a point where, these people are not getting letters saying I'm on my way. So, Wright just shows up one day. She didn't know he was coming. And then Ruffin, he doesn't show up in May. He doesn't show up in June. Is he dead? And then he shows up. A funny story I got from a guy I used to go to church with. He told me when he was hearing me talk about it, he talked about one of his ancestors, and he was one of the galvanized guys. And they said he showed up and the family was born in tobacco, and he walked up and just started helping them. Didn't say anything to them, just joined right in what they were doing under the barn with the tobacco, and said he still had his Yankee pants on. And they think that's why he didn't say anything. He just walked up and started handing tobacco, and they were like, "Oh, Billy's back." Right? Billy Boone. Now, he used to love to tell me this story.
That he had to sign up to get that. Could have just taken it from the captive.
That's right. That's right. Well, he was one of those guys. They had seen him too. Yeah. But Ruffin's kind of interesting. They were really close. I mean, Wright named one of his kids after Ruffin. They did have a half brother that was killed. They had a sister that died during the war, and then they had cousins that served as substitutes. I think all the substitutes they were related to, they all got killed too. So.
Was he alive when his brother was murdered?
Yes. Yep. I never found any attempts at revenge, so I looked. Matter of fact, the murderer didn't serve very long. I don't want to give too much away. He didn't. He lived. He didn't have too much trouble. It's very interesting. All right. Anything else? I mean, I'll stick around for a minute. I do have the books over here if anybody wants one. We can take credit cards if anybody needs to do that. I think that's it. Thank y'all.